Part 1. The First Inhabitants of America. Long before Europeans arrived, the land we now call the United States was home to millions of Native Americans. Tribes like the Cherokee, Apache, and Sioux had lived here for thousands of years, developing rich cultures, traditions, and systems of governance. They farmed, hunted, traded, and lived in balance with nature across the continent. In 1492, Christopher Columbus reached the Caribbean, opening the door for European exploration and colonization. Soon, Spanish, French, and English settlers began claiming land in the New World. While this marked a new era for Europe, it brought devastating consequences for indigenous peoples through disease, conflict, and forced displacement. The arrival of Europeans changed the course of American history forever. It set in motion centuries of transformation that would ultimately lead to the creation of the United States. Part 2. Colonization and Rising Tensions. In the early 1600s, European nations began to establish permanent colonies in North America. The English founded Jamestown, Virginia, in 1607, the first successful English settlement. Just over a decade later, in 1620, a group of English pilgrims arrived on the Mayflower, settling in Plymouth, Massachusetts, seeking religious freedom and a new life. Over the next century, 13 British colonies took shape along the Atlantic coast. Each colony had its own identity, economy, and culture, ranging from the plantations of the South to the trading hubs of the North. Despite hardships like disease, famine, and conflict with Native American tribes, the colonies steadily grew in population and prosperity. However, as settlers pushed westward, they clashed more frequently with indigenous peoples, leading to wars and forced displacement. Meanwhile, the British government, facing debts from European wars, began imposing taxes and regulations on the colonies to raise revenue, without giving the colonists any voice in how those decisions were made. Resentment slowly built. The colonists began to see themselves not just as subjects of the British crown, but as a people with their own identity and their own vision for freedom. This growing sense of injustice would soon ignite a revolutionary spark. Part 3. The Road to Revolution. By the mid-1700s, the American colonies were growing fast, but so was their frustration with British rule. The British government imposed heavy taxes, like the Stamp Act and the Tea Act, without giving the colonists any say in Parliament. This led to the famous slogan, "No taxation without representation." Tensions reached a boiling point in 1773, when a group of colonists in Boston dumped British tea into the harbor in protest, an event known as the Boston Tea Party. In response, Britain cracked down even harder, sending troops and tightening control. Across the colonies, resistance grew. Leaders like Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, and Thomas Jefferson began calling for unity and action. What started as protests and boycotts was quickly turning into a full-blown fight for freedom. Part 4. The Fight for Independence. By 1775, the tension between the American colonies and Britain had reached a breaking point. Armed conflict erupted at Lexington and Concord, where the first shots of the American Revolutionary War were fired. What began as protests had now become a full-scale fight for freedom. In July 1776, representatives from the 13 colonies met in Philadelphia. Led by figures like Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin, they drafted and signed the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, boldly stating that all men are created equal and have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The colonies were no longer just protesting British rule, they were declaring themselves a new nation, the United States of America. The war was long and difficult. The colonists faced a much larger, better-equipped British army. But with strong leadership from General George Washington, help from foreign allies like France, and the determination of ordinary people, the Americans held on. Finally, in 1781, the British surrendered at Yorktown, and in 1783, the Treaty of Paris officially ended the war. Against all odds, the American colonies had won their independence. Part 5. Building a New Nation. Winning independence was only the beginning. After the Revolutionary War, the new United States faced a difficult question. How do you govern a country made up of 13 different states with different needs, beliefs, and economies? At first, the U.S. operated under the Articles of Confederation, but it quickly became clear that this system was too weak. There was no strong central government, no national army, and states often acted like independent countries. To solve this, leaders from across the nation gathered in Philadelphia in 1787 for what became the Constitutional Convention. There, after months of debate, they created the U.S. Constitution, a bold new plan for a democratic government based on checks and balances. Power would be divided among three branches: legislative, executive, and judicial. The Constitution also protected the rights of citizens and gave the people a voice through elected representatives. In 1789, George Washington was unanimously elected as the first president of the United States. Under his leadership, the country began to find stability and direction. The Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, was soon added to protect individual freedoms like speech, religion, and fair trial. The foundation was set. From a collection of rebellious colonies, America was now a united, independent nation, ready to grow, evolve, and shape its destiny. Part 6. Expansion and Growing Pains. With independence secured and a government in place, the young United States began to expand westward. Fueled by the belief in manifest destiny, the idea that Americans were destined to spread across the continent, settlers moved beyond the original 13 states, claiming lands that stretched all the way to the Pacific Ocean. In 1803, the U.S. made a major leap with the Louisiana Purchase, doubling its size by buying vast territory from France. Explorers like Lewis and Clark were sent to map the new land and search for a route to the West Coast. Over the next decades, new states joined the Union, and pioneers traveled west in wagons, often facing harsh conditions and deadly conflict. But expansion came at a cost. Native American tribes were driven from their lands, often through forced treaties and violence. One of the most tragic examples was the Trail of Tears, when thousands of Cherokee were forcibly relocated, leading to widespread suffering and death. Meanwhile, as the nation grew, so did divisions, especially over slavery. The Southern economy depended on enslaved labor, while the North was becoming more industrial and anti-slavery. These tensions would soon erupt into one of the darkest chapters in American history, the Civil War. Part 7. The Civil War, a nation divided. By the mid-1800s, the United States was deeply divided. The North was growing more industrial and opposed to the spread of slavery, while the South depended heavily on enslaved labor for its agricultural economy. As new states were added, fierce debates broke out. Would these states allow slavery or not? In 1860, the situation reached a tipping point when Abraham Lincoln was elected president. Though he didn't call for ending slavery everywhere, Southern states feared his leadership would threaten their way of life. One by one, 11 Southern states seceded from the Union, forming the Confederate States of America. In 1861, the Civil War began. The war lasted for brutal years. Battles like Gettysburg and Antietam were among the bloodiest in American history. Over 600,000 lives were lost. But the war was also a turning point. In 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that enslaved people in the Confederacy were free. In 1865, the Union finally defeated the Confederacy. Slavery was abolished with the 13th Amendment, and Lincoln's vision of a united, free nation began to take shape, though he would not live to see it, as he was assassinated just days after the war ended. The Civil War tested the very soul of the nation. It ended slavery, but it also left deep scars that America would continue to wrestle with for generations. Part 8. Rebuilding and Looking Forward. After the Civil War ended in 1865, the United States entered a difficult era called Reconstruction. The country faced a massive challenge: how to reunite a divided nation, rebuild the South, and integrate millions of newly freed African Americans into American society. For a brief time, progress seemed possible. The 14th and 15th Amendments granted citizenship and voting rights to formerly enslaved people. Black Americans held public office, built communities, and began shaping their future. But progress was met with fierce resistance. Racism, segregation, and violent groups like the Ku Klux Klan worked to strip away hard-won rights, especially in the South. Meanwhile, America pushed forward. The late 1800s saw industrial growth, the rise of cities, waves of immigrants arriving from around the world, and innovations that would transform daily life: railroads, electricity, factories, and more. By the early 20th century, the U.S. had grown from a group of rebellious colonies into a powerful, complex nation. But the journey was never easy. It was shaped by conflict and courage, injustice and progress, failure and hope. The story of America is not just about its past, it's about its people. A nation built on ideals of freedom and equality, still striving to live up to those ideals. And that journey continues, one generation at a time.